What's up, everybody? Welcome to this episode of Forward to Extraordinary, a part of the Strictly From Nowhere podcast experiment. I'm your host, Justin Abrams, a serial entrepreneur in pursuit of wisdom with the goal of sharing it with all of you. And that's no different for today. You know, I think everybody kind of knows for now, I have a real fascination on what's happening in modern content distribution, monetizing your audience, owning attention is really the currency of digital for today. I'm fascinated by those that kind of figured this out years ago, before such accessibility, before agentic tooling, before distribution was one click away. Those that really saw the opportunity to really monetize attention and deliver value in the visual medium. And so before we even get started, I love kind of stitching together where my guests come from. A previous guest on the show, maybe from even like last week, I think it was. Shout out to Chris Fenton. You gave me a heck of an episode. And of course, pay it forward. Today, I'm joined with the founder of WatchMojo. Ashkan, welcome to this episode of Forward to Extraordinary. I can't wait to unpack your zero to market story.
Thank you for having me.
It's absolutely a pleasure. I think you might know a thing or two about owning audience attention and distribution and what does it look like to really make a modern content motion. Before we jump into business, I always love to humanize this thing to get started. Tell me a little bit about you, your human experience, what makes you unique before we jump into business.
Sure. I'm a Canadian entrepreneur. I live in Montreal, studied finance. I was born in Iran, lived a year in Spain. So from the get-go, my nature was very cosmopolitan and curious. After studying finance and graduating in 99, aging myself, the dot-com bubble burst, the NASDAQ market crash,
Sure.
then, 9/11. And the reality was nobody was exactly hiring Ashkan Karbasfrooshan from Montreal, like on Wall Street, right? So, but you had seen this kind of internet revolution. And so I just kind of bypassed the corporate routes and I joined a startup. It was a search engine. It was a search engine before Google was even out of beta. And I really liked the startup experience, but I realized I was more into media than tech. I love tech. I invest in a lot of tech companies.
Sure.
But I did feel that like tech was very binary, not literally zero sum, but it was like a winner takes all, which is good. But living in Montreal, I was like, well, I'm not really going to build a tech company here. There have been some, but if culture eats strategy for breakfast, the Montreal culture is joie de vivre. Here we work to live. We don't live to work. And I was like, okay, I think I can build a media company here, but a tech company would probably be a bit harder. And I was really, really passionate about media anyway. So after my startup experience, I then navigated into the world of content. So I worked at a men's online magazine for 5 years, and I did a bit of business. Well, that's not true. I did a lot of business development, a lot of sales, a lot of partnerships. But I kind of, that's where I found my voice. And I realized that like the writer's bug, and I just started to write, I was writing, I think it was 10 articles in a 2-week production cycle. So I was a prolific writer. In fact, from 2000 to 2005, because of some distribution deals, we had licensing our content to AOL and MSN. I was one of the most read columnists in America. It was kind of insane, but and then in 2005, that company got acquired first by IGN, then by News Corp. I was 27 and I got the entrepreneurship bug. And I was actually a reluctant entrepreneur. I was more of an intrapreneur at most. But I was like, if you want to treat your clients, your employees, your team, your investors, if you want to treat them a certain way, I was like, you have to be your own boss. So it wasn't about money. It wasn't clearly about things like that. I just wanted to be like the decision maker that listens to everybody and then makes the best decision. That really was what drove me. And I started WatchMojo, and I say success is many things, but it includes timing. And so I saw YouTube and I was like, this is going to disrupt media. Let's just build on YouTube.
It's a really fascinating story. One of the things that I find that are hidden superpowers of some entrepreneurs is the ability to see where the puck is going. And so you just kind of alluded to it, which like segues me into a really my next question, which is where does that spidey sense come from? like you looked at YouTube, it was in its infancy. I remember being like a kid, kind of like fresh out of college at that point. And with one of my friends, we were like, should we just make like impulse television and put it on YouTube? And it's just like all the silly stuff that we'd get ourselves into over the weekend. And like, I remember like the infancy of YouTube. It really had no direction. Brands were really not exploiting it. Attention was really not monetizable at that motion. It was before the algorithm, before the ad servers. Like it was, why did you think that was going to disrupt media?
So first of all, there are tons of things that I have no idea about, even after the fact, right? Like, let's be clear about that. I hate people that are like, I'm a futurist.
Yeah, me too.
But, the best investor and the best entrepreneur is a good social scientist. If you study history, if you understand psychology, sociology, anthropology, and then, yes, also business, you can connect the dots, right? So I grew up reading encyclopedias. I read magazines. I watched, obviously, a lot of TV, listened to a ton of music. But I was like a sponge, and I was like into history, and eventually not just sports and media, but the history of those things. And I understood what had happened to print and radio and TV and film, and also what the internet had done. So the same way that like cable TV disrupted market share from network TV, I could see that the internet, the first wave, the portals, and all the websites that came in the first era, well, I could see that they were basically creating more fragmentation in media. And I could see that like the audiences were going to flock to the internet, first text, then images, then audio, then video. And YouTube specifically was not the first wave of platforms. You had tons of platforms, before that. But again, timing, luck, many things. So as an entrepreneur, the good thing is I've written about these things. So there's like the paper trail. I was writing positively about YouTube and going to conferences, like the only person saying YouTube is the future. People thought I was crazy. Now they think I'm crazy for other reasons. But, the point is today I don't go to conferences because it's people that for 20 years were shitting on YouTube that now are like YouTube gurus. And good, you're allowed to change your mind, to be clear. But I'm like, where am I going here? Why am I here? I'll go somewhere where I could learn something different.
Right.
But so to succeed as an entrepreneur, you definitely need vision. Like vision is either capital V, which is, like knowing where the puck is going, or lowercase v, which is just looking at things and making up what you don't know with your team. But you need vision. Some people have more of it than others. You also need ambition because you do need to have a desire to do well and succeed. But really, it's like persistence. Right? So like you could be right about something. I was right about YouTube in 2006, so to speak, but it wasn't until like 2012, 13 that, let's say, both the platform developed and WatchMojo became, forget successful, just break even. And then you have to execute. You got to make sure you could operate or find people that operate. And then again, I don't downplay luck or timing. Love Mr. Beast. I don't think, Mr. Beast is the gold standard. But when Mr. Beast sits there and goes, oh, I could start a channel and do this or that, I'm like, it's a great soundbite, but I think it's like, it's also maybe just with age, maybe in 10 years, he's like, yeah, luck and timing played a bigger part. So whenever I hear entrepreneurs downplay luck and timing, I'm just like, okay, with time, they'll see how important that was. I think I would have succeeded at many things, not everything, but it would be such a intellectually dishonest thing not to admit that, well, we did start at the same time as YouTube when it was like, the family that arrives to Manhattan in 1800 and scoops up all of Fifth Avenue, they could run seminars on real estate investing, but dude, like you got there before everybody else.
Was right.
That was mainly it. Like the seminar doesn't need to go on very long.
Right.
And then over time, though, I did add even things like resilience, for sure, and patience. But so my point is, vision is key. You do need that, but I also don't want to make it seem like if you're not the kind of person that sees where the puck is headed, you're doomed. Because Rupert Murdoch, who was a great entrepreneur, he was never seen as somebody that was like the first to see an opportunity. But how did he make up for that? Execution. So when Rupert Murdoch understood that something was going to be big, and even if he was late, he then just kind of mobilized like a machine. So, you could score yourself as an entrepreneur in vision, ambition, execution, resilience, persistence. And so long as you get enough and focus on your strengths and build a team to kind of make up for any weaknesses, then you just are improving your odds to succeed. But again, success is not God-given right. You might still fail. It's the beauty of entrepreneurship.
I mean, it's almost a guarantee, right?
Yeah.
Like if you didn't fail, it's a big question mark. You need some of those licks. It's the impetus of this entire show is like, show me where the landmines are.
I used to joke that we succeeded because we ran out of ways to fail, which is maybe a bit more self-deprecating used to be. But
I feel that in my chest, man.
yeah, no. But the flip side, I also kind of, it's not being contrarian, I just balance perspectives. There was a time when, like, then in the startup culture, it was like, failure culture was like, everybody was like out bragging one another about how bad they felt. But I was like, bro, failure is like a step in this journey to find something that, even if success is fluid, relative, and subjective, that at least is successful. It's the same thing. Like, I used to write about, I've always written. So for me, it was normal. I think some people are thrown off that I'm so transparent, but I used to talk about like just the resilience and the toughness mentally. And I used to say, yeah, the same way you should go to the gym to develop your physical, like your muscles, you need a bit of challenges and setbacks. But, that doesn't mean that the end state is, to then just say, oh, my mental health, I can't do anything, because that's not really the way life works. Like, we're very empathetic, but if your boss at company XYZ is like, I need something done, I think they should empathize with that. But at the end of the day, you're a pro, you have to get the job done, right? So my point is a bit of balance in these things. But yeah, no, absolutely. Failure is part of it, and risk taking. Like, just think of any small thing, right? Like, these days you see vertical video and everybody's like losing their minds over vertical video storytelling. But like 5 years ago, Jeffrey Katzenberg, the K in DreamWorks, Spielberg, Katzenberg, and Geffen, he did Quibi. Now, tactically, he made a lot of mistakes, overfunding of series, but my point is that was timing. Today vertical series are very popular, but he was way ahead of the curve, right? So, that same idea today might work.
I have a couple of things I'd like to stitch together, all in reflection to what you just said. Probably the first time in the show's history, hundreds of episodes, that I've ever really talked about what I got my degree in, but you said it, so I might as well double back on that. My degree is in sociology with a minor in anthropology. I never really knew. I mean, I know now for years, but coming out of school and just trying to get my first jobs and trying to find my way in tech in my early career, I never really knew like what was the point of that education. It took me years as a professional salesman and digital marketer to like really stitch together that the study of people, groups, and culture was probably a heck of a way to begin. Now, some advice that I give to young people, I talk to young people all the time. I've created an in-person community to enable the local colleges here on Long Island and empower young people as they navigate the early market here. It's quite a bit different from what even I dealt with 2008, 2009, 2010. It's usually an emphasis on like, if you don't know where to get a job, how to get a job, practice the skill set of sales. Go find any type of a sales job. It could be retail, it could be slinging lemonade on the corner. Do something with that salesmanship, entrepreneurial perspective. I'm going to wrinkle that advice a little bit for today, which is maybe do a little bit of research on groups, culture, and how people work. And I find what you're saying interesting because it really is not some superpower about knowing where attention is going, knowing where mass culture and people are actually going to find interest. It's studying what is pattern recognition, right? It is what is classic about the human consumption experience. And so I love that because not everybody is just really keen to go out and be a sales professional. I wrinkle sales like you have to sell yourself to whoever you're going to marry. I got to sell myself to my son every day as I try and navigate the ice cream.
I sell myself to my daughters, and I'm not a useless, homeless, unemployed. Yes. I used to joke. I'm like, people fly me to talk about this stuff. You won't even ask me. I didn't mean to cut you off. No, but spot on.
No, you're right.
First of all, I grew up wanting to be a history teacher. I loved psychology, sociology. I would go to those teachers and they would see I was acting. I wasn't like studying, but they saw I was into it. That's why I got grades, because I would just listen. But when I would go to them and say, hey, I'm thinking of pursuing, I mean, both good for them, but it's kind of a tell. They would be like, look, Ash, unless you're going to go study another 10 years to get a PhD, don't go into psychology or sociology. And they would always actually shoved me towards what we called commerce. But commerce for us was just social science plus math. It was exactly social science. It was psychology, but you just had the math option. And I learned that taught me optionality. I studied finance. I was good in math, but I wasn't like good in advanced math. Eventually, I was like, I'm out of my element. I was like Rock versus Eminem. You know, the story where Kid Rock thought he'd be a rapper in Detroit, and one day Eminem showed up and out-rapped him, and Kid Rock was like, screw this. This is this white guy. This is the white rapper, not me. So I was like looking around at those kids in math. I was like, this is for them, not me. But I was really good at finance because I knew it was a lot of psychology. But what I'm getting at is, if you don't understand those things, you're just not going to be a good entrepreneur. And I'm not knocking the culture, and I'm not downplaying this, but like a decade ago, it was all these tech entrepreneurs have Asperger's, I think, or have autism, which is, I'm not at all downplaying, but it was like their badge of honor that they were not like, they didn't have people skills. They were that was like what the journalist was getting to, that they don't have EQ. And I'm like, yeah, if you're like a brain that could program or code a decade ago, it's like me as a writer, I just need to be alone, and then, okay. But what really made us, relatively speaking, successful, and I think what made me a pretty good leader, was that it was the psychology, it was the empathy. Now, granted, it's a human thing, it's by nature, but I think now I actually tell a lot of entrepreneurs or people considering entrepreneurship, I sometimes go, if you're good with people, you could find an accountant, you could find a programmer, but most people suck with people. They're selfish, they're self-serving, maybe a bit too much vanity, maybe a bit too much ego. Like, you need a little bit of ego, you need a bit of pride, but you don't want it to become hubris. Now, to your other point about sales, so when I was studying finance, all finance students thought we had a God complex, as if we were like curing polio, right? Which I found a bit distasteful, but I got it because finance was in commerce, like the top of the pile, so to speak. But I was working in customer service for the bank, and a client called irate, like, I'm going to sue you guys. I'm calling, New York Times or whatever. And I was like, sure, you could do all that. But I was like, tell me, what's the problem? Take me through it. Solved it. Very easy. At the end, he's like, okay, you know what? I must say, very happy. Like, good job resolving the issue. He's like, you're great at sales. On the call, I was just like, thank you, sir. But it stuck to me 25 years later. I hate to admit this because I went on and did a lot of sales and still sell. I was a bit offended. My first reaction was, well, I'm not a sales guy. I was like, I'm a finance guy, or I'm a strategy, or whatever I thought.
Sure. It feels cringy.
But it hit me. And I said, So when I started working, I was fine to gravitate and go to sales because I understood revenue is the lifeline. Nowadays, we get obsessed with angel investors and venture capitalists and growth capital and private equity, but in the old school, the OG entrepreneurs, it was revenue. So I kind of ended up repeating that message to everybody. I said, when you do an interview, you're selling yourself. When you meet a girl, you're selling yourself. When you are, fundraising, you're selling yourself.
Absolutely.
So I was like, sales, yes, I'm not talking about the department of sales that closes revenues, but my kind of like playbook, and I admit this may not scale to 5,000 employees, but my goal was never to do that and then like not know 99% of my team. But I've always said things like customer service, things like culture, things, are omnipresent in the company. It's almost like everybody should have a customer service perspective because your customer is also an internal client. Like we might have somebody that will research a topic and somebody else will go find the video B-roll and somebody else may edit because their expertise, to quote Plato, and the comparative advantage and the principle of specialization is video editing or it's voiceover.
Sure.
But the point is you're passing a task to somebody in a supply chain, even if it's content. So you have to be customer service oriented because if you don't do a good job and the next guy suffers it, the whole system breaks down. So I've been very very empathetic, very pro-employee, pro-creators, yada, yada. But I realized after many years that I do have these kind of red lines, and it starts with just respect for your teammate, respect for the process. If something is wrong, speak up. But the idea absolutely is sales, service. These things should be universal,
blast me back to the early days of WatchMojo. I think it's transparently so. I think it's even on the homepage of the website. I think you talk about it on social media. There's like this goal that we see in modern business building, and it's like the victory of raising capital.
Ugh.
It's like, it is not about the other things. It's not about building culture. It's not finding gainful employment. It's not about revenue. It's not about profitability. Like, dare I even say that word? Talk about a cringy word today. And so you come from a totally different perspective, which is like, you're absolutely waving the flag of a bootstrap business, never had to take outside capital. And there's a story arc there, because now as an investor, you're on the other side of that table, which is the badge of honor that I see founders waving. I'm of the same. I'm a fully bootstrapped business. I leveraged the home to take out a small business loan. I have made every possible financial mistake that you can possibly make, especially in service business. And yet here we are past all of that. And I don't regret doing any of that. I don't regret having another third silent partner. I don't regret being diluted. I have no regrets of not going that route, although it certainly was possible. Where do you think like that badge of honor before anything even starts? Like, I just went and raised, a pre-seed round. You don't even have the validation as to whether you even deserve to exist in the world of business yet. Yet this is the thing that people are really battling against. Like, what's your perspective?
So I want to just point out a few things. One, I'll always be like pro, humans and pro entrepreneurs and pro students. So I don't want to sound like, first of all, I'm Gen X, but like old boomer there, like yelling at a cloud. Like, but just if I were, because you brought it up. So let me first, again, being intellectually honest. The reality is I tried to raise venture capital, partly because I knew I wanted to go beyond my means in terms of what my vision was. But I did stick to my principles, meaning, I didn't want to turn WatchMojo into a content farm and scale for scale's sake. I was like, no, it's balance. You need quantity, but you need quality. You need frequency. And the definition of quality changes, right? Like, even like what YouTube has, the reason YouTube's been so revolutionary is because it's changed all that. Now, to answer your question, I believe that prophets were the original entrepreneurs. Let me explain what I mean. You had prophets who basically, I'm an atheist agnostic, but if anybody's religious, I get it. Some of my rejection of religion is because I was born in Iran, where you see what religion hijacked can do to a society. If I grew up in Alabama and church was part of my family, I would probably feel differently.
It would be different.
Right? I was Jewish and, I would feel differently. Even if I was Muslim in any other country, I would feel differently. So please don't take this as a knock. But I grew up atheist and agnostic because of that. We'll call it trauma, even though compared to others, there was no trauma. But I do believe that the prophets early on, whether they believed it was divine intervention, revelation, or inspiration, I think they largely were virtuous, had good intentions, and a bit like organized religion, then that gets bastardized and there's a loss of fidelity. But they were kind of establishing the rules of engagement just to be a good human. Like, hey, don't sleep with your neighbor's wife. Oh, it's a commandment. Or like, everybody stinks. You should wash your feet every time you pray. Okay, this ensures people wash 5 times a day. Like, there were practical reasons whether you pork. I love bacon, but yes, if I'm roaming the streets and I see a pig eating their poop and living in the same area, I'm like, God said, let's just be a bit logical. But again, you believe it, more power to you. But then eventually that profile of leader who had his naysayers, who gets crucified for, were kings and commanders, and then explorers and discoverers, then investors and scientists, then media barons, then technologists, and today it's actually storytellers, creators, influencers. I'm not comparing speed with Jesus, to be clear, but I think if you look at history, there is certainly a through line where Moses becomes a Mr. Beast. Okay?
Yeah.
Anyway, not to make fun of it at all, but I'm just saying it's always these people who go against the grain. They don't necessarily at first think they're special. They don't think they are the chosen one, but they are philosophers in that they kind of have their own point of view and they test it out. And I think entrepreneurship is for those people who want to walk to the beat of their own drum. And historically, if Richard Branson was entrepreneurial, his classmate David wanted to be a lawyer and his other classmate Michelle wanted to be a doctor. And then it was like they want to be bankers. Then they want to be venture capitalists. Today, kids want to be entrepreneurs or creators.
Creators, right?
I get it. And that's why my focus, yes, I've invested in and advise a lot of tech entrepreneurs, but my expertise is the intersection of storytelling and entrepreneurship. It's more, because technology is a different racket. Technology, you can't really bootstrap because the sums required are so different. But so in this sociological and anthropological change, I think in our generation, like I was Gen X, but I'm talking even millennials, Gen Z and all, there's been this kind of well, I don't want to go and get a job and save money, let alone go up to my aunt who's a bit wealthy and say, give me a loan to start a business. I want success right away. And the reality is venture capital, angel investors, private equity, those are people that have endless amount of money who are running out of ideas. They got their real estate, they got their stocks. Eventually it's either crypto, energy, alternative, gold. I don't want to be I like art, but I'm not going to be an art collector, right? So eventually there's all this money that comes to a bigger and bigger cohort of so-called entrepreneurs. I will never knock them. Sometimes on X, I'll joke venturepreneur is like somebody that raised money from a venture capitalist. You're not an entrepreneur because you work for them now. Wantrepreneur is somebody that talks about it, never starts. But it's just fun. I don't mean any disrespect. But my point is, it's basically just a reflection of society's impatience. I remember when I used to go to New York, constantly meet VCs before YouTube and WatchMojo took off. I also thought I needed VC. I thought for credibility even. I remember a lot of publications were like, hey, we'd love to do a story on this, but if you don't have venture funding, it's almost like a red flag. And I was like, this is batshit crazy. But I never looked at it as an excuse. I understood that the things that I wanted to do were not what an investor would prefer. Even just outsourcing, not India, but what India represents instead of outsourcing. I was okay, if we're going to have a Spanish channel, I want those guys to be in Mexico or Argentina or Spain. But I'm I don't really want to have an army. Manila's a beautiful place. I love Philippine food. They're great people. But I don't want to spend my days building an army of people in Philippines to put people in my community out of a job. Now, but if you're a VC and you see this now, today I say this, people, the money's there. Today, if I wanted to start anything, because of the track record, they're okay, whatever you want, more or less. But at the time, as naive as it was, I was okay, this is one transaction. I then got to live. I got to live with my actions. I got to go tell a team, hey, 10 of you, it's been great having you on the ride. I'm putting a bullet in your head and your kneecap, and I'm throwing you in the East River because I got all this money and I got to go hire this army in Malaysia. What the hell? To me, that was not success. But my point is, it boils down to an increased focus on the bottom line. I love the internet, but the internet is sad. And I don't blame social media. I go people. It's people inherently, unfortunately. Hence this, I'm not religious, but I do believe in the cardinal sins and virtues. I think people are just so nearsighted. I think people also struggle. I think people have debt. If you're a young kid, you finish school, you come out with random number, $100,000 of, even $25,000 of student debt. Yeah, you're not going to be I'm going to build a business that's built to last. You're hey, some kid invented a fart app. I will invent the super fart app. And you can't blame them because all the investors are investing in fart apps. And it sounds crazy, but I've seen it through the cycle. So it's a very long way of saying that I tell these days entrepreneurs, between AI, and I think there's fair criticism of AI, just to be very clear. And I think AI's productivity tool, generative, is a bit more thorny. I do get that. I'm not a sociopath that doesn't understand these things. But I just tell students, young entrepreneurs, that I'm like, I understand why a decade ago you had to take VC money, but I'm like, I would encourage you to look at opportunities where you could bypass that. Doesn't mean you don't go raise money later, but then on your terms, when you have a lot more leverage. And yeah, when then people will listen to you instead of just saying, here's a check, now do exactly as I say.
It's never easier to build any idea. The greatest innovations are locked up in non-technical people's brains. And today, with the tooling that's available, the ability to build something is actually no longer the barrier to entry. What I'm finding, maybe you'll corroborate with me, what I'm finding is that distribution is actually the secret superpower, but it's not foolproof. We were talking about a little bit before, there's very interesting use cases, for example, with Mr. Beast. He's got arguably the largest distribution on the planet. Like, combine the next couple of channels together, he still has more.
For non-tech, like excluding the Apples and Googles in terms of media individual. Yeah.
Totally. But then you see, like, he'll have a venture into a new category. For example, his Feastables. Arguably not like a super successful launch into consumer packaged goods, just in comparison to other products that live in that market. But then you see other folks that have also done that, like derivative products based on attention. The one that comes to my mind is like Logan Paul's Prime drink. Arguably has done a very good job as far as distribution, focusing on his youth category. What I'm fascinated by is, and maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, building distribution ahead of the idea ultimately gives you this strategic advantage. Like, I could build anything I want, but who the heck am I actually going to sell that thing to is the conundrum of today. And so I wonder, like, is it build the thing first? Is it work on distribution and audience first? Is it happening simultaneously? And so the reason why I ask is a little bit self-serving for me. I built a business. That thing fuels everything else that we work on. And then I backed into distribution, which was building strictly from nowhere, which has certainly audience captivation. And like, that has done well on its own. It's now a business self-servingly on its own. I did it outside of an order just because I had to make money first. I had the constraint. I left a career behind, and I couldn't just be like, oh, I want to be a content creator. I have to make money. I support the income. I have to support the mortgage, the family. Like, I had constraints. And so I kind of feel like I did it in like the way that I had to, but if I could do it again, and the next venture that we go on is piggybacking off of distribution, because I now have that built in place. And so I wonder, somebody who has certainly built an audience and has distribution for things that you want to build, are you finding that those things are mutually exclusive?
Okay, so 3 points. First of all, there's a saying that I coined years ago. I like a lot of people's quotes, but this one, I just said, what scales overnight is never sustainable.
Love that.
And then what is sustainable doesn't scale overnight, right? So first of all, again, Prime and Feastables both get very high grades. But if, like, I used to teach entrepreneurship, so if this was a case study, I would argue Prime maybe came out of the gates bigger splash, far more of a noise, but in a good way, sales, market share. And then it kind of, compared to Feastables, I think crashed a bit more. Whether it was quality or just, whatever, people being, I don't need sugar, water, whatever, whether it was like backdrop or the product doesn't. Whereas Feastable, which would also encounter, I read an article, slower growth, I think that maybe was built to last a bit more. So maybe it came out and it didn't crush it compared to Prime in year one. But I see that having more long-term resilience. But it's also, I think, a reflection of Mr. Beast and how his empire is versus it's Logan Paul, not Jake Paul, that does.
That's right.
Logan Paul and K-Side. Okay. Now, to your answer, I, like 20 years ago when I started, was arguably one of the more like vocal and visible pro content entrepreneurs. Like, we were like 3 in the world. It was like rare, like, who the hell invests in content?
Gary Vaynerchuk.
Yeah, no, but that's it. But also, like, nobody was funding it, right? That content funding was like a platform like YouTube. It wasn't the content. But if you go back to what Sumner Redstone, the Viacom, originally Paramount founder, said, content is king. And then Bill Gates repeated that in an article when he bought Corbis. I think it was a bit of a disservice, with the benefit of hindsight, to media executives, because it gave everybody this false sense of security that content is literally king in this impenetrable, infallible, super superior thing. First of all, distribution is queen, and we all know who runs the house. So in the old era, where you had gatekeepers, where newspapers were really just an excuse to monopolize local advertising and classifieds, and a lot of wealthy industrialists like William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer would go into media for two reasons: to attack their competitors and to ensure that the journalists would not go through their garbage. If you read their biographies, this is a fact. So in this era, where the world has become far more democratic in terms of media, and YouTube has democratized production, distribution, yada, yada, I think it's intellectually dishonest to think that content is still king vis-a-vis distribution. We may have all these subscribers, all these views, all these YouTube tomorrow. Some employee leans on a button, deletes all channels with W. We're screwed. Like, it's not a very complicated thing, right?
Right.
And somebody else, we don't use AI with WatchMojo. I go, employees, I don't want to come and hound you and be like, did you use AI? I'm like, if you use AI, just chronicle how it's used, chronicle, but there should always be a human involved. It can help you write or edit. I write so much. Nobody goes, Ash doesn't write, he used AI. But everybody's happier if I use AI to edit it, at least, right?
Sure.
But what I'm getting at is somebody else could start today, leverage AI and kind of compete with us more aggressively than how we could use AI, because we have an established brand. So the media world, the world of content, has become a paradox where, in a way, because everything is much more vertical, and like if I come and listen to Justin, it's because Justin's talking about topic A. If you start talking about topic B or C, I'm like, whoa, stay in your lane.
Right.
So somebody else could come and be like, I like what Justin's doing, and I'm going to do it a bit differently, and then come and attack him after the fact, right? So what I'm getting at is, you need a product. Like, you need a product, you need a service, you need a thing. So whether that's content or whether that's a tech product, an app, whether it's a service, I still think it starts with the thing. But I think what has changed is the definition of distribution. Meaning, you're better off taking something, and instead of producing 1,000 videos or go produce 100,000 widgets of your product, or going all in and building a fully baked app instead of a minimum viable product, an MVP, that's what's changed. That you should stress test. You should see if your vision has any demand, or it's just in your head, or sometimes it's timing. So to put it all together, what I tell people is, the same idea at a different time can work. Yeah, the tactics may change, but sometimes it's just the timing. But today, you are far better off, more so than any other time in history, to iterate and tinker and test in public to get feedback, because you'll just minimize the errors, you'll minimize the costs, you'll minimize the risk. You'll eventually get like an egg on your face. You'll eventually make a mistake or something just doesn't work. But I'm just saying, you won't waste 10 years of your life before figuring out something in the first year that might make you succeed much faster.
I have a portion of my sales cycle when I'm speaking to new prospects that want to come into Cause of a Kind, my agency. We build software, but I have an inception studio. So I see a lot of greenfield projects, a lot of professionals that are coming out of a career that had a great idea. They saw a gap in the market. They want to build a first product. They want to make a run at running their own software company. I love that. The killer thing that I say in my prospective sales equation is, you're actually paying me to kill your idea. If I can't kill it, you have throughput. And so my question to you is kind of building on what you were just talking about before, which is like kind of the discipline of building the right thing. Timing, of course, is everything, but today you could build anything and all of it. And so we were talking about the minimum viable product, but like there are other minimums. Your minimum sellable solution, your minimum investable product, like different milestones that you can kind of think about. Viability is really only good as like your nearest competitor. Unless you build something that is like in a total gap, like absolutely novel. The likelihood is that there is somebody that came before you, in which case parity, like minimum parity product is actually what we're talking about. And so where is like the discipline of creating the right thing, assuming timing is at your back, like that you're just in the right moment in time to build something. There's a certain discipline that like you have to develop. And if you've never built businesses before, it might not be inherent. And so what do you think about the topic of discipline when building a business?
Well, no, I mean, discipline is super key. I mean, again, in the Bay Area, there's like this mindset of it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Sure.
I think that is like Saint Benedict's quote. I like to quote that other patron of arts, Chris Rock, who goes, just because you could drive with your feet doesn't mean you should. Let me give you a personal example.
That might be the title of the episode.
Yeah, pretty much. Let me give you a personal example. So
Sure.
I like music, I love sports, but WatchMojo became more known for movies and film. So a decade ago, I was like, let's launch a label, let's sign indie artists, and then we'll kind of build stories around them, their stories, their origins. But there was no through line, and the artists came and went, and then COVID hit, but it was clearly not like a commercial success. And then a decade later, last year, I was like, I grew up on like heavy metal, hard rock, rap, techno, I didn't grow up on Iranian music. But we were doing a top 10 Persian music songs. And as I was researching it, I just had this like epiphany to be like, wow, it would be cool to take these songs, translate them, and then like reimagine them as like hard rock songs. And because I'm a writer and I like that challenge, I started to translate, I started to write, compose. It was kind of cool exercise. So I started to look for musicians, and I won't lie, the vision wasn't getting through. It was a bit like saying we're going to take Aretha Franklin and reimagine it as a Spanish Sepultura heavy metal song. I understand why societies like this won't fly. But in my head, I was like, no, you could take Celine Dion and have like a Black Sabbath style song. It was like clear to get it.
Yeah.
But this is like, I'm just being very transparent. I don't know you'd ask, but I do think it's a great example. I call it my own private Quibi, and I'll explain why. Regarding timing.
Yeah.
So after a year, the project went nowhere, and there was a lot of externalities. The musicians I was working with who happened to be in Iran, like they were going to perform in English, but they happened to be there. There was the massacre. The project went nowhere. So I used Suno, generative AI, to basically create like proof of concepts, demos, but the quality was so good that that's semantics. But the idea was these were proof of concepts for me to show musicians.
Sure.
Because then I'm not like discussing a vision and they just see me as Mr. Investor, Mr. Entrepreneur. They have no idea I've written books, produced documentaries, and like I'm a creative person. But once I had the demos, it was smooth. People got it. We promoted these songs without hiding that it was AI, but just even talked about an American Idol like series where we looked for the right band, the right musician. Because I was like, this is just a hobby. For it to be a commercial endeavor, you need to tour, like the content today, the songs, is not really what you make the money on, if you think about it. Mr. Beast loses money on his productions because he's crazy in a good way and invests so much, he makes it up with Feastables. But when our fans on WatchMojo, and we were putting these songs on another channel, Sound Mojo, when they would hear it, they'd be like, cool, WatchMojo sent me, very nice. But, and the likes were like 90% positive. We then had a couple of like the internet culture drama channels, which I love. It's part of the ecosystem. We're always too boring. But when they kind of did videos saying, I can't believe WatchMojo, and I get it, that like to a younger audience, especially generative AI, not the same thing. Whereas I look at it as there are ethical ways to use any technology. But let's set that aside. But this was a great lesson. As much as I say the best social scientist is the best investor is a social scientist, and I talk about the importance of timing, even if most of the backlash and the criticism of using Gen AI to create songs, even if most of it was coming from like non-WatchMojo fans, I still thought the feedback was priceless. And the reason why I said, look, in 5 months, I ultimately produced 5 albums, 50 songs, spanning genres. I wrote most of the lyrics. I used AI to edit and, find a syllable match or whatever. But it taught me a great lesson that just because the tech is there, if the timing is not there, that's something. Whether you like it or not, it's something. But so I had, and this again, it's all written, I'm not making it up. I had already realized that, like, well, at some point, a 6th album, a 7th album is diminishing returns. I need to go find these musicians. So this had started already. But what I'm getting at is you do have to start off with something that you like, not what is for the people. You have to take into consideration the environment. But if you look at all of the really, really successful content case studies, it's always been somebody like you said, who doesn't have a plan B, who burns the boats, who has to make it work. And like to us crazies, setback is not even a speed bump. Criticism is part of the recipe. Like I love to cook, I take feedback. Without feedback, I wouldn't cook. You know what I mean? It's part of what you want to see. Anyway, but all to say that, yes, I think in 2026, more or less any entrepreneur, I'm not saying any person, because if you're not entrepreneurial, don't bother. But any entrepreneur can technically do anything. But you really have to ask yourself, is this something I'm willing to do for 2, 3, 4, 5 years? Is this something I would almost do for free? Not that you should, but there's somebody else hungrier with even less of a plan B who will do it for free longer. And then, yes, do you have a comparative advantage? Are you passionate? Yada, yada. But I'm just saying, yeah, you can't just be like, just because I can do something, I'm going to do it, because then it doesn't really take into account all the other variables that make something a success, right?
You're literally speaking my story over here. Like I was 6 years in the dark with this show, just doing it out of straight passion, just because I enjoyed the conversation, didn't want to feel so alone on my entrepreneurial journey. 6 years, crickets, nothing. The persistence of the whole thing, the equation, the consistency, like showing up literally 50 times a day in everybody's feed. There's a formula to the madness, but what I'm fueled by is becoming passionate about the opportunities that come my way. I never really went into business for my passions. It was always like an opportunity presents itself. Could I be passionate about that? Because that's the currency, right? It's like I did this absolutely bootstrapped, as low of an investment as I possibly could to make it of high quality. The consistency and the persistence is actually the secret recipe. But the discipline of knowing when to kill something, when to stop, read the equation, like that's a muscle. You kind of have to fail a bunch of times to get that right.
I always go, whether you're talking about a media company that says, I don't want to be on YouTube like 20 years ago on our site. I'm like, why are you fighting gravity, bro? Yeah, I'm like, it's like male pattern baldness. You may not like it. It's happening. So I always tell people, I mean, I've never said this to anybody. Even using Sound Mojo, it's pretty clear to me what the next steps are. But I also realized if the timing, I mean, first of all, I'm not doing 5 more albums using AI, but I'm just saying, even if I wanted to, if I don't recognize that timing is not something you as an entrepreneur control, you're going to fail. It's more the tactics, whether it's Sound Mojo, whether it's WatchMojo. But we've also, we've done 100, let's say we'll use a round number. We've done 100 projects. 5 have been successes that any other company would love, like a Miss Mojo, like other things. One of them, like WatchMojo, and thankfully, because of timing, because of luck, because of the environment, because of YouTube, the entire generation that grew up on YouTube, which is a lot of people, they grew up with things like WatchMojo. You do ultimately just need to get it right one time as an entrepreneur.
Right.
And that is the greatest part of it. Now, your own pride, your own boredom, your own life situation. Like if I was in the Bay Area, I'd be dropping 20 more startups because I'm looking at my neighbor who's got 19 startups.
Totally.
Thankfully, I'm like, these are all projects. I like them. I know how they can become a business, but it's not the first thing out of the gates is not business, right? It's got to make sense. And frankly, I think that's just a reflection of media today. there is somebody else that is probably a better expert at things than you are. You do have to find that one thing where you are, if not the best in the world, at least better than 99% of 99% of people. And that's really where I think it's not so much passion. Passion is great, but I do think it's those things: demand, supply, your areas of specialization. That's how you succeed.
We talk about this. It's like the pursuit of mastery. To be a self-proclaimed master, that's maybe a little narcissistic and maybe a little nuts. The pursuit of mastery, I think, is actually what the goal is find something that you're actually fired up by and try to be outstanding at it. Like that to me is really the goal. As we round third base, I often open this up to my guests for the last word. These conversations kind of dredge up all sorts of things. There's no possible way that we could have every topic covered. But before
I mean, the main thing I would say is there's really no limits to what you as an individual can accomplish. It does take a lot of ambition, vision. Well, I'm not saying everybody, you just sleep and you're like, why is my life not what I want it to be? But if you are driven, if you are ambitious, if you're curious, if you're humble, you need to be a bit brash, you need to be confident. But again, if you're a normal person, there's really no limits to your success, provided two things: you don't let others set the limit for you, and you don't set a limit for yourself. When you work for somebody, nothing wrong with that. I've done it. I wish
me
I could
too.
have been an employee. Nobody was hiring me.
Sure.
But you're effectively letting others set a limit for you. That's why you have to work for people that see the best version of you. And I sometimes get burned because sometimes I envision things in people and they don't have it and they don't have that capacity, and it's fine. I figure out what they're good at and focus on that. But even yourself as an entrepreneur, you can't set a limit to yourself. Like for me, it wasn't about like, oh, I want to have a media company and have 5 clients and produce 2 projects a month and, make 20% profit. I never measured it like that.
Sure.
I measured it more like, well, I want to have a team and we are good at things. And yeah, as much as I always like top tens and music and movies, I mean, I like everything. I was writing books. We could have gone into essays, long form, scripted. But I do think that like you do have to grow comfortable in your own skin and balance confidence, curiosity. And frankly, entrepreneurship is, as they say, what's that saying? It's like you work a few years like few are willing to work in order to live the rest of your life like you can. And I'm not talking materialistic. I drive a very non-flashy car. I bought a nice house just because I was like, I can't have all my net worth in digital media and stocks. But I'm not I'm not judging. I'm a pretty simple guy in that sense. But I've always said it that like you want to have the peace of mind. I hate the word FU money, but I'll land here. I call it I don't care money. You ultimately want to be in a position where you could say no to things and
Of
no to people.
course. And most people just want like the sanity to not have to wake up and check the bank account of whether they can go grocery shopping. It's really
And
simple
that's
stuff.
also the worst thing I feel that successful entrepreneurs do is they don't have that empathy to understand that, yeah, you're saying all these things now because I'm not a billionaire, because you're a billionaire. But like, do you remember what it was like to live paycheck to paycheck? Like there was a time where my meal was tomato, lettuce, and mayo sandwich, and it was delicious. I'm not complaining, you know. But so I do think oftentimes entrepreneurs, you get to a point and like you lose your sense of humanity. That like, I go grocery shopping myself because I love to cook, but it helps that then when it comes at the end of the year, I'm like, I remember my bacon was half the price. How do you justify a 2% salary increase to your team when nothing went up just by 2%, right? So this is what I mean. Like, I think more and more, if you're going to be the best entrepreneur, it's because you have people skills. Because even in the age of AI, you're dealing with people, you're motivating people.
We're absolutely aligned. I've enjoyed our conversation very much. I learned quite a few things. I think it actually fits incredibly into what the show's premise was actually about, which is just unlocking the curiosity of actually what does it mean to be a great entrepreneur and be a great business leader. There is no real playbook, but there are some actual, points of truth that if most people really pursue, they'll end up being successful. Ashkan, I'm a student. I'm a student of you and what you've built, and I'm trying to find my way. And I am super appreciative of your conversation and our wisdom that we've gathered for today. I wish you and everything you touch forward to extraordinary.
You're too kind. Thank you. It was my pleasure. Anytime. Have a lovely day.
To you. You too.
Cheers.